Okay, folks, welcome. Good morning. We'll give Jeremy a chance to set up, and while he's setting up, I just want to introduce this upcoming workshop. It's basically a precursor to the ABA certification, which Jeremy will tell you a lot more about in this presentation. This is his thing. He does that very well. And he has training programs that if you're interested in becoming a certain applied behavior analyst, he's the person to go to. However, this course is like an introductory course. What it does, it draws on those strategies in a way that will help regular teachers and regular TAs and parents even deal with behaviors, reduce behaviors in the classroom or at home. This is a certification course, and if you're interested in learning more about it, scan the QR code. You'll hear more about it as the time goes on. The dates have not yet been announced, but it will be in April, so that's for sure. So without further ado, let me stop sharing and see if we can get Jeremy to share. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Noel. Good morning to you and everyone. Okay, let's get my PowerPoint going. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third installment of Pathways to Literacy. This morning, I'm going to be presenting to you on the subject verbal behavior analysis explained. And we've got some simplified Chinese subtitles, which I hope will keep up with the technical terms, of which there will be a few as we go. Don't forget to tune in next week to the fourth and final chapter of the Pathways to Literacy presentation workshops, where Mr. Scott Campbell, Ms. Hilda Mann, and of course our illustrious leader Noel Roberts and myself will be available to put it all together as the title suggests. Okay, so thanks for the kind introduction, Noel. I'm Dr. Jeremy Greenberg, and I've been a board-certified behavior analyst since the year 2000. I came from Teachers College, Columbia University, to Hong Kong about 13 years ago and have been working in the field of special education, applying what we know to students in an international school environment. And also, as Noel said, teaching a verified course sequence, the first and still the only place to get behavior analysis certification in Hong Kong. We do online and in-face hybrid courses. All right, so let's get into it. Verbal behavior was a book, actually, written by BF Skinner, who could be described as the father of behavior analysis. This text was published way back in 1957. Yes, that's older than me. I know, hard to believe, but true. It was sort of an extrapolation or an extension, if you will, of one of his earlier works from 1938 titled Behavior of Organisms. From that, he sort of discovered, you could say, the principles of behavior that we know today, such as positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, stimulus control, discrimination, not that kind of discrimination, more like discrimination of stimuli insofar as concept formation, and many other learning principles that he discovered. The the text verbal behavior and the behavioral approach to learning and language development was a bit controversial at the time. It was a slight departure from the traditional sort of psycholinguistic and otherwise developmental theory of learning and language at the time. Skinner focused more on the functional properties of language rather than on the formal. He also suggested that language is learned through consequences, really, social consequences for that matter. And he preferred to use the terms listener behavior and speaker behavior compared to the more traditional receptive and expressive language, which we still use those terms even today, I think, to some degree. And the reason he did that was because the listener is not just receiving words and as like a bucket being filled up with water. Instead, the listener in any sort of given situation has a role to do. The listener or the audience mediates the behavior of the speaker. The term mediate really just means sort of like shaping. It has to do with reinforcing or sometimes punishing or correcting the role of the speaker. So the listener has got a job to do. And this is evident through a lot of gestures, a lot of nodding, a lot of yeah, that you can observe listeners do, especially in Asian languages, Japanese in particular. There are a lot of audible sounds that listeners will do in order to sort of reinforce or, again, mediate the behavior of the speaker, to acknowledge that they understand what they're saying and that they should keep saying it. There was a difference as well in the description of vocal verbal behavior and other kinds of verbal behavior. There's a lot of verbal behavior that doesn't involve words, of course. There's textual responding, text and sign language, for example. We have picture exchange communication system, or PECS, which is used for children who are learning to communicate using words. So there were some significant differences between Skinner's verbal behavior and the traditional psycholinguistic sort of theories at the time. One of the big takeaways from B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior text was his description of the 6-part functionally independent verbal operants. He felt at the time that there was a lack of terms to describe what he observed in terms of language. So he developed these words, most of which are kind of invented by him. Echoic behavior is echoing, repeating. It's behavior where the antecedent and the behavior are the same. Okay, he would say that the behavior has point-to-point correspondence to its antecedent. The term mand, perhaps you've heard of, is short for command or demand, and a mand is essentially a request. A mand specifies its reinforcer. Can I have 2 more red candies, please? Is a mand. Pass the salt is a mand. Can I go to the toilet? Is a mand. Help me, please, is a mand. And of course, you're probably seeing already how these are functionally related. We use echoic prompts to teach mands to children who otherwise are not fluent speakers just yet. The term tact is when a child, or anybody for that matter, comes into contact with an object or an event, and they label that thing. Oh, it's a bird, or it's a train, or I see a red book. Those are tacts. And They have to do with objects or events. And people make a lot of tacks all over. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later, because that is a critical capability that will lead to success, or in some cases not success, with students in regular classes. Okay. The term intraverbal has to do with behaviors that sort of lack the point-to-point correspondence to their antecedent. So in a way, they're sort of like the opposite of echoics. Small talk, answering questions, stating information, these are intraverbal responses. Okay. The term autoclitics is sort of a funny one, and that has to do with forms of verbal behavior that quantify, qualify, affirm, negate, or specify other forms of verbal behavior. So they're sort of commonly referred to as adjectives in our traditional sort of description. So candy can be a mand. If I say candy and somebody gives me candy, then that's a request and that's a mand. But if I say, can I have 3 more green candies, please? That's a mand with autoclitics. And the same goes with tacks. School bus can be attacked. If somebody says, yeah, you're right, that's a school bus, I'm labeling that. But if I say it's a school bus or it's a yellow school bus, that is a description of tacks with autoclitics. Transcription is a term that has to do with behavior that sort of switches in its modality. And what I mean by that is if I'm reading out loud, whereas the antecedent is printed text, and my behavior is vocal verbal behavior, that's an example of transcription. Or if I happen to be lecturing, which I am at the moment, if you are taking notes, then that's an example of transcription. So the antecedent in this case is my vocal verbal behavior, and your behavior of writing it down, writing down the words as print is an example of transcription. So the reason that these 6-part verbal operants are described as functionally independent is because even though you might have one form, even though I may be able to label candy, that doesn't mean that I can necessarily ask for it when I want it or when I see it. So even with the same forms, sometimes children lack the sort of functional usage across these verbal operants, and therefore they have to be taught directly in many cases. More in verbal behavior. So I just mentioned a bit on the functional independence. There are terms for pure and impure mands and tacks. So if somebody requests something, then it's called a pure mand. Or if they request something in response to the question, what do you want? Then we say it's an impure mand, because there's like a verbal antecedent. And the same with tacks. If I say, what is this? That would be an impure tact, whereas just holding up an object and with somebody labeling it, that would be a pure tact. We use echoic to tact or echoic to mand training sequences for younger children to teach them how to do these. In last week's really terrific talk by Ms. Hilda Mann, she presented many excellent strategies for how to promote language and social skills in different kinds of learners. The students who she was referring to could be said to be sort of low needs, I think it's fair to say. Whereas this week, my presentation leans a little bit more towards children with like moderate to severe behavior problems, learning problems, language problems. And so we really need to rely on this type of heavy teaching technology and very technical language to help induce language in children who otherwise might have pieces missing, behaviors missing. In Skinner's behavioral approach to language and learning. There's a description of private events, which is thinking. We all think, we have thinking, we have feeling, and these are behaviors, he would say. Difficult to measure, yes, of course, but nevertheless, they are behaviors still. There are tact extensions, such as metaphorical extensions. There's a term that he used titled multiple control. So if I put multiple colored objects on a table in front of a kindergartner and I say, point to the green one, the child is hearing me say, point to the green one, and seeing multiple stimuli on the table. So that has to do with multiple control. And the description of this type of situation can be useful in assessing or troubleshooting, I should say, learning problems, especially in younger children. Language assessment. Verbal behavior is very useful in its language assessment. It helps us decide really what to teach. So like if a child is missing requesting behavior, or they're missing labeling behavior, or they're not answering questions, or they're not asking questions, which is demanding for information from others, which, by the way, is a type of social skill. Social skills usually are types of verbal behavior. And when people ask questions of others and they inquire about, how are you? What are you doing this weekend? Do you have any trips planned coming up? Demanding information is a type of social skill. And when people are observed to request information and ask questions of others, they're usually described as social. So when looking at social skills deficits in children, or even adults for that matter, we can have a very useful path forward if we consider the verbal operants and what might be missing in their repertoire, and we can sort of meet them there and try to move forward. So verbal behavior and verbal behavior analysis, by the way, verbal behavior analysis is a subfield within applied behavior analysis. And it has helped us to identify these verbal operants and what is missing so that we can sort of move forward with any given child, let's say with special education needs, whether it's autism or any other special education need. Okay, the observational learning is a very critical capacity, not just imitation, but observational learning. And the term naming is here on this slide, excuse me, with a capital N. And I want to talk for a second about that because it's very, very important. So naming is, with a capital N in this case, refers to learning the names of things incidentally. So I'm going to explain that for a bit. Tacting or labeling things is a very critical for children to be successful in school and in life. It's vocabulary building, and most intelligence tests are primarily, I would argue, based on vocabulary, learning the names of things and learning what words mean and all of that. So traditionally, we can use flashcards, we can do sort of basic drill and practice to teach children basic vocabulary words and math facts, animals, shapes, colors, clothing items, musical instruments, community helpers, etc., etc., etc. And we can use direct instruction to teach children the names of things, as we do in early primary years. Also, in regular school classes, mainstream classes, children learn the names of things by observing other student and teacher interactions. So a child in a grade 1 class might be sitting next to another student, And the teacher might ask, okay, kids, what is the capital of China? And one child will raise their hand and get called on, and the child will respond, Beijing. And the teacher will hopefully provide an appropriate social praise consequence. Yes, you're right. Well done. Beijing is the capital of China. The other child or children sitting nearby observe this learn unit, we would call it, and they're probably going to learn that Beijing is the capital of China simply by observing the teacher-student interaction next to them. That's observational learning. That's how group instruction is able to work. The teacher doesn't repeat the question 20 times, and when the students then get some sort of independent desk work or a worksheet a few minutes later, the students are likely to get correct responses. They'll have learned it simply by observing another student and teacher emit the correct response. Well, in the third type of learning the names of things, there's no direct instruction, and there isn't even a learn unit. Maybe two people are walking in the park and they see an eagle flying, and one of them simply comments and says, oh, wow, I see an eagle. And the other person hears the first person label the eagle and look and see the eagle, and from that experience they can then know that that bird is an eagle. Prior, they didn't know that that was an eagle. And so just learning the names of things incidentally in that sort of natural type of a manner is called naming in the field of verbal behavior analysis, again with a capital N. And it's a very critical capacity that will lead usually to children being successful in school and in life. So 3 ways to learn to label things: direct instruction, through observational learning, and naming with a capital N, which is learning the names of things incidentally without any direct instruction. Okay. Verbal behavior analysis, again, is a subfield within applied behavior analysis. It's based on research, and it sort of works in concert, you could say, with what we know about developmental theories of language development. But it goes beyond that because we have evidence where we know which behaviors now sort of come first, second, and third. Verbal behavior analysis is concerned with environmental interventions and identifies relations between the environment and behavior. The goal enables the behavior analyst to provide effective teaching interventions, manage faulty verbal behavior. For example, some of the people here in the audience today may have had experience working with children with autism. And children with autism frequently have echolalic behavior. Echolalic behavior, just like the name implies, is when the child may echo the question. If you say, what's your name? And some children will respond, what's your name? Even sometimes when they know the answer. And so that's faulty verbal behavior. We also have another technical term, palilalia, which means nonsense talk. And that's when children have like vocal stereotypy and vocal stim behavior. And we have some interventions that have been successful for treating those. And then, of course, replacing the missing verbal capabilities. Here is we're going to get to a list in a moment here of the verbal capabilities. But again, research-based information that directs the behavior analyst to decide, number 1, the current level of student functioning. Number 2, what to teach. And number 3, protocols to induce verbal milestones. Okay, so we don't call it teaching anymore at this stage. Verbal behavior analysis is about assessing what verbal milestones are missing in a given student, applying protocols to induce those. But it's not curriculum per se, because these are skills that most kindergarten children come to school already able to do. So while we have things that look like assessments and scripted programs and lesson plans, it's not teaching per se. It is inducing protocols with verbal milestones that, again, most typical kindergarten children already come to school knowing how to do by age 4 or 5. But in many children with special needs, these verbal milestones are missing, and therefore we need special protocols, research-based, evidence-based protocols for how to teach those. There are 9 verbal milestones. Pre-listener. Some children come to school for the first time and they do not listen. They are completely dependent on adults for everything. They don't attend, they don't follow directions. They have a lot of difficulty with that. Soon, we hope a child could learn to listen more consistently. They can be, their attention can be reliably guided by a teacher. They can observe other children in some cases as well. And then we hope that speaker behavior emerges, or we need special tactics to teach children to speak if that's not happening otherwise, sort of naturally. There are conversational units, which sometimes have to be taught directly as well. So in school, we teach children to mand, to request objects, items, desired items. We teach them to tact. We teach them to label things in the environment, of course, and we teach them to answer questions. That's the intraverbals that we mentioned from a previous slide. And we can combine the answer ask into a conversational unit. So if I say to you, how are you feeling today? You might say, oh yeah, I'm feeling pretty good, thank you. How are you? And that's one conversational unit. Okay, how are you? And then I'm fine, thanks, how are you? Which is an answer ask behavior. So we combine those into conversational units, as many as we can, given the child's age and what might be sort of age appropriate for them. There's the naming behavior. As I mentioned, of course, we have reader behavior, which we view as sort of an extension of listener behavior. Yes, reading is an extension of listener behavior, because when you read, you are also listening to what you are reading. And for students who have difficulty in reading comprehension, that is likely because they're not fluent readers. And so they're taking so much energy and effort just to decode what's on the page. And it occurs slowly at first, that they really just don't have any more capability to describe what they're reading. To that listener behavior sort of is a key component to reading. And many children sort of learn to read, but they can't talk about what they've read. And that's because the listener component is a little bit underdeveloped. And then, of course, we go to writing. Writing we view as an extension of speaker behavior. Writing is similar to speaking. It's in a different format. It's in textual words, written words, obviously. And then we have writer as own reader, which is self-editing behavior. And then, of course, verbal mediation for solving problems. Problem solving is sort of a higher level of verbal milestones, because it relies on understanding what we've read and how to apply that to given problems. So that's a type of verbal milestone as well. In terms of listener capability, listener behaviors, people who function as listeners can be governed by the speaker behavior of others. That's right. Listeners function to, remember that word from earlier, mediate the behavior of the speaker in later stages of this capability. Listener behavior is responsible for and involved with conversational units, naming, self-talk, which is a very important capability. Little children, 3, 4 years old, they'll play with dolls and they'll pretend that one is speaking to the other. That's where the student is functioning both as speaker and listener, rotating those sort of speaker listener exchanges. That's a very critical capacity, which kind of evolves into thinking later. Say and do correspondence, reading comprehension, problem solving, listener reinforcement in social interactions. We prefer the term listener and speaker, as I said earlier, instead of receptive and expressive language. Why is that? It's because listeners have a job to do. They have to affirm or negate or reinforce or shape the behavior of the speaker. They don't simply just receive language in a one-directional type of a manner. Basic listener literacy is a prerequisite to pretty much everything else. This is true. Visual tracking, instructional control, voices conditioned as reinforcers, even very young children, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. If they're laying down in their crib and their mom walks into the room talking on the phone, they will look and orient towards the mother's voice, because the mother's voice has already become a conditioned reinforcer as she's talking and breastfeeding and all of that. So for little babies, voices become conditioned as reinforcers very early on. And if that's not the case, then sometimes we need to do some special protocols in order to teach that behavior, induce it. And we do that through a special tactic called auditory matching. There's an app called Sounds the Same, which was developed by some of my colleagues at Teachers College, which helps to teach this kind of auditory matching behavior. You know, excuse me. The term literacy is fairly commonplace. When we think of literacy, we think of reading and writing or speaking, but there are many types of literacies. There's listener literacy, there's digital literacy, there's scientific literacy, or should we say a lack of scientific literacy. And I think just as a little kind of sidebar, I think that the pandemic really helped to illuminate the problem of lack of scientific literacy in our communities, really. I mean, even governments. Okay, so there are 5 basic literacy attentional programs that are really important for children to learn. Sitting down and following one-step instructions, sit still, look or look here, do this, imitation, response, and then generalized imitation are the 5 basic literacy attentional programs. And with young learners or children with maybe serious autism or other kinds of serious learning problems, this is a good place to start, because everything is going to be that much, everything else that you want to teach your student is going to be that much easier after they've mastered and have become fluent in these basic listener literacy attentional programs. This is a figure on basic listener sequence from the text called Verbal Behavior Analysis by Greer and Ross, 2008. Just to give you a little sense of how you might go about this process. So we're asking questions here. Is attention to the teacher missing? Is attention to instructional stimuli missing? And if it is, then we need to master the visual tracking protocol. Is the capability for sameness possibly missing? If so, then we need to do the sensory matching protocol there. Okay. So we've got a number of successful tactics and protocols that we can apply based on an analysis of what might be missing in a student's repertoire. Now, a couple slides ago here, I talked about the basic listener literacy programs, and what some colleagues did back in 2005 was they did an intensive version of that where they taught not just mastery of listener behaviors, but fluent listener behavior. Fluency is a a combination of both speed and accuracy. To be fluent is to be fast and correct. And so they taught some children to follow instructions like super fast, 30 in a minute, in fact. And as you can see from these data, the dark bars represent learn units to criterion. That's like trials to criterion. How many trials did it take on average for the children to master an objective, a learning objective? It's a huge number. On the top graph here, we see like 1,000 trials, okay? And on the bottom graph, we see about 500. After the intensive listener immersion program was applied and the children became fluent at listening, the amount of instruction needed to teach the children to mastery was basically cut in half. Have you ever worked with a student and thought, is he not understanding what I'm trying to teach, or is he just not attending properly? Many special education teachers and therapists have asked this question from time to time. And when you pause maybe on the instructional objectives and sort of go back to basics and teach listener behavior to a fluent level, you will probably find that everything else is that much more easy to teach. Okay. Visual tracking is when a student cannot master the attentional programs, especially the eye contact program. We would implement the protocol for visual tracking. We teach in, excuse me, 20 learn unit instructional sessions. We use a small object and we use cups to say, find the toy, for example. And we move the cups around to teach them to attend to what is on the table. And it teaches visual tracking and it reinforces attentional behavior. When attention to the teacher is missing, we use the listener immersion protocol, which is also a critical capacity that we need to induce in students where that's missing. Okay, I mentioned a bit earlier about the sensory matching protocol. And so, for example, there's like a sounds the same application that you could download and use. And this also involves other sort of matching. So, for example, you might have some pictures or objects and give a child, let's say, like you have some, like an orange peel in a glass, and the child might smell the orange peel and then have to like point to the picture of the orange to match across a stimuli. And this is a kind of a same to same activity, which helps with auditory matching as well. When the capacity for emitting speaker verbal operants is missing, we need to use the echoic prompts to teach MANs or TACs. In some cases, students do not echo words. There are children with, some of you may have experienced working with some children who are, well, I don't like to use the term nonverbal, but they might be sort of struggling to use words correctly. So we do have a couple of interesting protocols that can be helpful in teaching children to echo and repeat words more consistently. There are two. One was developed by So-Young Yoon in 1998. It's a stimulus-stimulus pairing technique where you would hold up a desired object, actually tickle the child, and when they make a sound and you prompt them to say the name of the toy and then deliver the toy, they may start to get more consistent about vocalizing to get a desired item. Because they see the desired item, they hear your prompt toy, and with the tickling, they will make a sound, and then they receive the object. So they start to pair up the vocalization and the requesting of the object. So that's kind of a fun little procedure to use. Generalized imitation is an interesting procedure that was developed by Denise Ross, a good friend and colleague of mine, and also one of the authors of the verbal behavior analysis text. This is where we provide some gross motor and fine motor imitation responses, like do this, do this, do this, and then some fine motor ones, and then prompt to ask, then we deliver an echoic prompt to ask the child to say the name of the object that they want, and it frequently does induce echoic behavior. We've seen this protocol work with a 13-year-old student who really had no vocal speech, and this sort of helped him to start vocalizing. Amazing, really very powerful techniques when implemented correctly. We can teach mands and tacts. These are very important. Usually I suggest teaching mands first, because there's that built-in motivation, because you're asking for something and then getting it. So there's, basically a mand is like you're specifying the reinforcer. So that has a built-in motivation to it. The first step is to establish what the student wants and to provide an echoic prompt to evoke the mand form. The prompt is faded and the full sentence form is trained up. Tacts are also trained using this echoic tact training sequence. In both cases, the controlling antecedent for pure mands and tacts is nonverbal. That's right, for pure mands and tacts, it's nonverbal. It's the object or the desired object or the event that is the antecedent, not always the teacher's asking, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Many stimuli that children are expected to learn to respond to are nonverbal. When the child sees a book, they should pick up the book and look at it. When the child sees something that they want, they should ask for it, rather than having to always respond to adults saying, it's time to do this, it's time to do that. What do you want? Do you see this? Do you see that? Sometimes we just have to hold up stimuli and maybe prompt the child to respond to it, but not always deliver vocal verbal instructions. Okay. Time to read, time to do this. Nobody asks us to read. We just see words and we read it, right? Okay. Echoic prompts and learn units are used to teach each function. Sentences are shaped and autoclitics are added to the behavior as well in mand and tact training. This is a teaching sequence for level 1, level 2, and level 3 basic mand teaching procedures and tacting procedures. They're echoic prompts, and then we shape up longer sentences, basically, is what that looks like. And again, this is from Greer and Ross, 2008, verbal behavior analysis. Protocols, my slide is cut off here. Protocols for inducing new capabilities. Scientific tacts over recent decades were aimed at how the teaching environment would change behaviors. However, the question of what to teach had been relegated to traditional curricula and therapeutic or psychological approaches, which were kind of non-scientific, frankly, and based sometimes on a lot of researchers' own children in some cases. So instead, now we have a little bit more robust view of language and learning. For example, Rosales, Ruiz, and Bayer back in 1996 described behavioral cusps. Behavioral cusps are behaviors that have significant and far-reaching implications for further developmental stages. Walking, talking, reading, writing, these are behavioral cusps. When you learn to read, that's a behavioral cusp, because learning to read is massive for the individual, because you can now do 20 things that you couldn't do before. You can read the instructions on how to assemble something. You can read ingredients for how to prepare a meal. You can read the label on a clothing item to learn how to launder it properly. You can read a map to get from one place to another. You can read a book for enjoyment. read, and on and on and on. So it's such a big capability. And behavioral cusps are really like reinforcers also. Observing, the behavior of observing should function as a conditioned reinforcer in children. And if it doesn't, that's a problem. And we need to induce it. We may need to teach a child to learn to listen and learn to look and learn to attend as a social reinforcer, learning to watch their peers and listen to their peers is a huge reinforcer. Okay, when the capability for emitting speaker verbal operants maybe is missing, we have to teach echoics to MANs. You may also need to get the echoic behaviors with two protocols, as I described before, the stimulus-stimulus pairing and also generalized imitation. I mentioned earlier in the presentation a little bit about fixing faulty verbal behavior. And there were two terms that I mentioned. The first was echolalia. Echolalia happens in many children with ASD, whereas they may echo the question. So if you say, how old are you? They might echo, how old are you? One of our colleagues, Vinny Bruno, did a really great little project back in 1997, whereas he made a sentence, he would make like a little sentence strip and write the name of, he would write the answer on here, like the word five, F-I-V-E. And he would teach the child to read the text, basically, just say, five, okay, good. And do this repeatedly until the child were able to master that. And then he would reintroduce the question, but now with the textual prompt, like, how old are you? And the child would read this, and then you would, and say five. Yay, you're right, you're five. And then fade out this prompt systematically over time until the child is able to answer the question appropriately. Textual prompting, beautiful, neat little procedure that has been found to successfully treat that pesky echolalic behavior. Palolalia is a technical term that means nonsense talk. So this scripting behavior or verbal stereotypy, if you will. Stereotypy is the sort of clinical term for self-stimulatory behavior like hand flapping and that sort of thing. And Irfa Karbali and colleagues, Dr. Greer included, did a research paper that's published in the Analysis of Verbal Behavior in 2005. And what they did was they did tact corrections. So every time the child would make a sort of silly, nonsensical sound, me, something like this, the teachers would give it, correct the student by sort of prompting them to make an appropriate comment in the class. So they'd say, oh, I see Johnny has a red shirt, or I see a green book. And as a correction for this nonsense talk, and it actually proved to be quite useful. And you can read about that in the Analysis of Verbal Behavior here. Sometimes in children, the need to read might be missing. And we have protocols for that, which involves, basically, it's like we play a game. We have 3 containers and a word written on it, and they have to find the, let's say there's a toy in there. We'd say, find the toy. And, one of the containers has the word toy on it. So there's some built-in motivation for them to kind of try to read the labels on the boxes to get the toy inside. The other involves hidden preferred items and a list in a scavenger hunt type of activity, which can be really fun and sort of provide motivational circumstances for children to learn to read. Learning to write. Establishing the need to write. Writing can be very difficult for many children for a lot of reasons. Fine motor skills aside, sometimes just getting words down on paper can be really difficult. The need to write usually springs from the understanding that writing affects the behavior of the reader. Once the student has basic writing skills and can form letters legibly, the teacher can arrange for periods throughout the school day in which all communication is made in written form. This, again, can be sort of like a fun game-like atmosphere. Let's say for the last 30 minutes of class, all communication ought to be in written form. And that certainly prompts writing and can be kind of fun and motivational for children as well. This is called the writer immersion protocol. Students are asked to describe using multiple exemplars and affecting the behavior of the reader. This is another writing tactic where basically you would take the class and break them up into two groups, and one group has to write instructions to the other group. And if the other group performs the instructions correctly, the first group gets a point because they've written the instructions correctly and the other group is able to follow them. So the writing team gets a point. This is a fun kind of activity as well. For more on research and publications in applied behavior analysis and verbal behavior analysis, you can check out my website, which is knhk.net, Knowledge Network Hong Kong. Thank you for listening. I think we are about out of time, but I am happy to try and answer any and all questions that you may have on this subject of verbal behavior and verbal behavior analysis. This is my website. This is my email in case you need to get in touch with me sometime later. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Jeremy. That was exciting. That was very informative. Wow, wonderful stuff. So we can open now for questions. If anyone has questions, you can simply unmute and ask directly or type it in and we can do it for you. Any questions?
Hello, I feel excited for knowing something about Skinner's theory and this framework of analysis. And would you mind giving me some suggestions for me as a beginner to know about it, to learn something about behavior analysis? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for your question. Well, there are workshops, there are classes. The work of BF Skinner is quite far-reaching in the field. You can kind of get involved in the field a little bit by going to abainternational.org. That's the Association for Behavior Analysis International. abainternational.org, I think. Or just Google or look up the Association for Behavior Analysis International. You can look at events, workshops, discussions. Sometimes a lot of it is for free. And you could, if you wanted to get formal instruction, you could sign up for a class to really get some basics going. But I think that a good starting place would be our sort of parent organization, which is the Association for Behavior Analysis International. Yeah.
That's a good question, Beam. And also in the beginning, I mentioned that we are putting together a course that will draw on a lot of what Jeremy just says and a lot of what is in his formal certification course so that it is easily applied in the classroom in all kinds of situations, not just the severe autistic child. Yes. So you can, both of us, you can reach out to either one of us, and Jeremy will probably be a guest speaker in that series as well. So it's all inclusive, and this will give you a taste of whether or not this is for you, and you can kind of segue right into his program. But anyway, we can talk more about that later. Okay, let's see. Questions. Okay, any other questions? Okay, Jeremy, do you think that you could put together a list of definitions that were used, maybe a lot of the words that were used and terms that were used here today, and maybe send that to me, or we can add that and send that in the group at some point?
Okay, sure.
All right. Anyone else? If you think of questions that you may want to ask, and again, I'm going to send in the groups a QR code whereby when you scan it, you'll be able to select who you may want to ask questions to, or the questions that you have for different speakers for next week, so that we can begin to collect a lot of those questions that you may have. You will also have the links for the replay for all the 3 sessions that we have had the last 3 weeks, including this week, so that you can go over them, write your questions down, and then scan the QR code and write your questions in for the person that you would like to ask that question to. And we can have a great time next week during the panel session. Okay, Jeremy, thank you so much. Really,
Thank you, everybody.
we had a great time and we are on time. So last call for questions. Any comments, questions, anyone? Okay, let's see, what's this? Okay, Pamela says thanks. Okay, folks, thank you all, and I will see you next week for the panel, putting it all together. Thanks again, Jeremy.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.